Sandrine, you're an expert, and we are very happy to have you with us. You're an expert who has done such an enormous work on Sophie Grouchy, who was also another outstanding philosopher of that time. And only recently, let's say, you turned to Olympe de Gouges. And knowing your work and all these things, I'm very interested to hear your interpretation also of and on Olympe de Gouges' philosophy. But please tell us first a bit about her life, you know, in strict terms. When did she live and how did she end?
Okay, well, I think everyone knows how she ended, and that's how most people during the French Revolution ended at the guillotine. She was born in the south of France, in Montauban, in 1748. That's right. And she was brought up speaking not French as such, but Occitan. She was brought up running in the streets, talking with the local kids. She didn't have much of an education. She went to the local non-school and picked up some reading and writing, a bit of maths, what a young lady from the province would be expected to know, but not much more. But interestingly, she had the chance of getting a much better education had her mother wanted her to, because her father was not her mother's husband, but he was a local nobility, the Marquis of Pompignan. And he was himself a playwright, one of Voltaire's great enemies, because he was a bit pious, and Voltaire didn't like that much. And he offered to take on his illegitimate daughter and teach her. And we don't know why, but the mother said no. No, I'll take care of her education. And she didn't do a great job of that. Now, when she was 17, Olympe was, she wasn't even called Olympe then, she was called Marie. She was called Marie Gouges. She had her stepfather's family name, Gouges, which she then changed to Gouges, because softening the Z, but that's a very small change. And she then took on also her mother's first name, Olympe. That was later in life. When she was 17, she was married off to a man who was working, he's sometimes called a butcher, but he wasn't. Her stepfather was a butcher. He was somebody who was in charge of getting meat and charcuterie and other such foodstuff for nobility. So that's what his job was. He wasn't actually a butcher. So it was a little bit better in terms of rank. She didn't like being married to him, and she didn't stay married to him for very long. He disappeared. We don't know whether he died or just left, or whether she just left him. But we hear nothing more about him. By the time she was 19, and then she had a little boy, and she and her little boy moved to Paris, and she changed her name. And then she used the fact that her real father was from the nobility, just dropping a few hints here and there to get into the right kind of society. She met her half-brother, she started making friends, and
she became a playwright too.
She became an actress first. Before she became a playwright, she joined amateur theatrical groups, and then she set up her own. And then eventually, but quite a lot long, about 10 years after she moved to Paris, when she was in her late 20s, she started to write, but not before that. And one reason, perhaps, is that she wasn't very comfortable in French. She wasn't brought up in French, she was brought up in Occitan, and she would have had a very strong accent when she first came to Paris as well. So she had to get used to the language, and she had to get used to writing as well, but she never did, in fact. She never felt comfortable holding a pen. And of course you have to remember that back then, they used, goose feathers, which is probably, I don't think I'd be able to write with one of these, and she certainly wasn't. She wasn't comfortable with it. So she had to wait until she had enough money to employ a secretary. And people made a lot of that. They said she was illiterate. They keep saying that she was illiterate and that she didn't write her own stuff, but we know that women philosophers tend to get that treatment anyway. So she once challenged somebody who she was just in a car on the way from the suburb to Paris, And it was a carriage, there were a few people there, and there was a man next to her who was talking about the famous Olympe de Gouges, saying he knew her very well, he was one of her admirers, wink wink, no, not, and that, everyone knew that she didn't write her own stuff. And so she managed to stay calm somehow, which was a big thing for her because she was a very temperamental woman. And she just asked him, well, you seem to know her well. How do you know? I heard she writes her own stuff. She just says it. And he said, well, no, somebody teaches it to her first so she can pretend to dictate it and that is her own stuff. But no, she doesn't. She's just too dumb. And as they left the carriage, she told him, well, you idiot, I am this Olympe de Gouges whom you speak of. And, I would never be your friend, so stop saying that. And that kind of story is what was told again and again. The gossip was spread. She got in trouble with some actors at the French theatre, and then they told everyone that she couldn't read as well.
But explain us a bit to understand what kind of importance it had at that time, writing plays for theatre and the political meaning of being such a playwright and being discussed in public. Yes.
So we're talking about the years before the revolution, and that's when Beaumarchais, for instance, was writing, and his plays were very political, and she really admired Beaumarchais. She went to knock at his door.
What kind of plays did she write?
So she also wrote political plays. She wrote a play. Her most famous play is a play about or against slavery. It's called Zamur and Mirza, and it's a story of slaves who are running away, and they're shipwrecked on an island, and they make friends with some other people, and eventually they're caught again, but they're forgiven. Yeah. And it's all about showing that slavery is wrong, and that there is no inequality between people of different skin color. In fact, there was a movement within the French Revolution for abolitionism, and that was the most famous part of that movement was started by Mirabeau and Condorcet and Brissot, and it was the Société des Amis des Noirs, the Society of the Friends of the Black, and Olympe de Gouges was writing about slavery before that, and it was Brissot, in fact, who made sure that her play was performed, because the Academy was a bit, they didn't want to perform it because they didn't like her. Yeah. And he invited her to be one of the early members of the society. So she was actually quite influential in that sense. But she also wrote plays about divorce, about women being forced to take vows to go into convents.
Now we are going to the next topic. So we talked about her being a playwright and what it meant at that time in Paris. But yes, her philosophical importance, or why we think she is worth of being studied in the philosophical sense, depends on her having written the Declaration of the Rights of Women. So please explain this now to us, also in comparison to the Déclaration de l'Homme.
Okay. So that's obviously her most famous text, and perhaps not the most interesting one philosophically, actually, but it's so she wrote it almost as a parody. It follows the Déclaration des droits de l'homme, which was published
as a parody?
just yes. It follows it step by step, but every time it says man, she says woman. I think it's also meant to be taken seriously in some sense, but I think that the philosophy comes before and after in the letter to the Queen, and then...
Okay, but I found it always very interesting that she added very specialized things on the right of adoption, a child, and, and the right before court, and so on. So she specialized in it very well.
So that's something that actually Sophie Gauchy also talks about, and I think, to be fair, it's Montesquieu who started the whole thing, talking about the specific laws to do with parenthood, with adoption, the laws to do with what happens when you have a child out of wedlock, whether that child should be recognized, given the same rights as a child who's born within marriage. And that's something that concerned a lot of women at the time, because if you're a man and you have an illegitimate child, well, you can just go about your own business in the 18th century. If you're a woman that happens to you, then you're left to bring up the child, and you have no rights either for yourself or for the child. And that means very often poverty for both the mother and the child, and that's something that she was extremely concerned with. She was a very practical philosopher, and a lot of her texts are concerned with making the French public and the French politicians especially recognize the poverty that women are drawn into because of the kind of stupid decisions that are made at the level of documents like the rights of man.
Okay. So you said that you hold that the preamble and the end of this is a more philosophical issue.
I think so.
That there are other texts that are more philosophical.
I think so. So just as the thing about the preamble and the postamble, I guess.
Yeah.
In that she has this interesting phrase. She says that women are basically vicious. They're not virtuous, and that when they're not allowed to participate in politics as citizens, what they do is that they use they work through nocturnal ministrations. Okay, that's a fantastic phrase, and people read that and they think, well, she's being a bit sexist here, very much in the same way that they think that about Wollstonecraft. And there is an interesting parallel here, which is namely that she thinks women only do harm, and she says women do harm and have done a lot of harm in politics when they're not allowed to participate. And Wollstonecraft says something very similar when she says that she's in her letter to Talleyrand, in the preface of the Vindication of the Rights of Women, she says, well, if women are not treated as rational beings, if they're not allowed to do politics as a man would, they're going to do it anyway, because no matter how much you fail to educate women, no matter how much you put us down, we are still rational beings. We're not animals, and so we're going to try.
This is wonderful. Okay. But before we switch to Mary Wollstonecraft, please let us now and bring perhaps Olympe de Gouges to death.
Yeah.
How did she come? How did
so as well as writing plays, then she wrote and as well as writing more longer philosophical pamphlets or even books. The one I'm talking about on Thursday, Le Bonheur Primitif, is a small treatise. So she's not just a playwright, she's not just a pamphlet writer, she's also a proper philosopher in the sense that, we understand philosophers when we talk about male philosophers, I suppose. She wrote long things that were sustained arguments, etc. But she also wrote placards. She wrote articles that were printed on one page and posted all over the walls of Paris. And she wasn't the only one to do that. Everyone did that in the Revolution. That's how you shared ideas. So even Condorcet, etc., they all did that. If you wanted something publicized, you printed it on one page and you posted it everywhere in Paris. And she was having it printed herself. She had her printer, and she also had her, her distributor, I guess. And towards the end of her life, she'd been getting into more and more trouble because she was writing letters against Robespierre, for instance. She was being very...
Why did she write against Robespierre?
Well,
so it was the famous Les Troisièmes.
That's the last text. That's the text that did for her. Yeah. But before that, she was accusing Robespierre of corruption. She was denouncing his treatment of the Girondins. She saw the end coming of the terror, and she was... Instead of going into hiding, she was very vocal against the ruling party. And then eventually she decided to go into hiding. She went with her son and her son's wife to their country house, a house that she just bought. But then she decided to come back to Paris for one more poster, and that was Les Trois Urnes, in which she advocated, she asked that there should be a referendum, in fact, asking the French people what sort of government, what sort of a republic they wanted. Okay, whether they wanted
which
direct democracy.
Did she offer?
Exactly. So there was direct democracy, there was a federated state like the United States, and there was also constitutional monarchy. So let the people choose. And the very fact that she'd proposed constitutional monarchy and that she'd questioned the government and the republic as it was meant that she was arrested immediately.
Wonderful. Do you think that she was in that political action singular, or did she have a club of friends who supported the Troisième? One can understand that there are friends and these things never emerge from one only, but
she was a Girondin, but she was very close to Girondin. But by the time she published this, she was very much by herself because they'd already been arrested, as far as I know, and they weren't. Or if those who weren't arrested were in hiding.
Yeah.
So I think she was. I think she was always thinking her own thoughts, and because she was very quick about having them published, there wasn't much time for consultation most of the time. So I think in that case, especially because most of her allies were either in prison or in hiding, it was just the wrong thing. Yeah.